announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
At dawn, the ocean is calm. Too calm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, steel moves through water, radar screens glow, and commanders wait for an order that may never come, or may come too late. Over the past 48 hours, tensions between Colombia and United States have reached a level not seen in decades. Official statements speak of routine maneuvers and defensive positioning, but satellite images tell a different story. A carrier strike group has taken up a forward position. Submarines have gone silent. Maritime patrol aircraft are flying patterns that suggest preparation, not deterrence. What makes this moment different is not just the show of force, it's the speed. Decisions that once took weeks are now made in hours. Algorithms flag threats faster than diplomats can react. A single misread signal at sea could ignite a chain of events no one fully controls. According to leaked shipping advisories, commercial vessels have been quietly rerouted away from key corridors. Insurance rates for trans-Caribbean cargo spiked overnight. Ports remain open, but dock workers report unusual security protocols and sealed communication zones. None of this appears on official briefings. Yet everyone involved seems to be preparing for the same unspoken possibility. At the center of the tension is the sea itself. Naval power has always been about presence, but presence can turn into pressure. When warships operate within close proximity, every maneuver becomes a message. A turn to port, a radar lock held a second too long, a helicopter launched for observation. These are the moments where history can tilt. Military analysts warn that a naval encounter would not resemble the battles of the past. There would be no declaration, no clear first strike. Instead, a fast escalation driven by uncertainty, electronic interference, denied access zones, vessels shadowing one another in international waters. By the time the world realizes what is happening, the confrontation would already be underway. What happens next would not stay at sea. Energy markets would react within minutes. Regional alliances would be tested. Governments far from the Caribbean would be forced to choose sides or scramble to avoid being pulled in. The phrase, localized conflict, would lose its meaning. And yet, behind all the hardware and strategy, the situation hinges on human judgment. A captain deciding whether to change course. An operator choosing whether to classify a contact as hostile. A leader weighing strength against restraint while the clock ticks. This is why the world is on edge. Not because war is inevitable, but because it feels possible. Because the distance between signal and spark has never been shorter. Because the ocean, vast and silent, is once again becoming the stage where global stability is tested. In this video, we break down what is happening at sea, why it matters far beyond the region, and how a single naval encounter could reshape the geopolitical landscape overnight. Stay with us. The current escalation did not emerge overnight. It is the result of months of deteriorating political signals, unresolved security concerns, and growing mistrust between Colombia and the United States. Publicly, both governments continue to frame their actions in the language of stability and defense. Privately, however, officials on both sides acknowledge that relations have entered their most volatile phase in a generation. Diplomatic channels remain open, but they are increasingly strained, weighed down by accusations, denials, and carefully worded warnings that leave little room for misinterpretation. At the heart of the tension lies a broader shift in regional dynamics. Colombia has spent years strengthening its security posture, modernizing parts of its military, and asserting greater control over its coastal zones. Officially, these efforts are aimed at combating organized crime and protecting maritime infrastructure. Yet recent policy statements suggest a more assertive stance, emphasizing sovereignty and resistance to what Bogotá describes as external pressure in regional security affairs. While such language stops short of naming any specific country, it has been widely interpreted as a response to increased U.S. military presence and surveillance activity in nearby waters. Washington, for its part, views the situation through a different lens. U.S. officials argue that freedom of navigation and regional stability require a visible naval presence, especially amid rising uncertainty across the hemisphere. Internal briefings leaked to several media outlets claim that American intelligence has detected irregular Colombian naval readiness patterns, including accelerated training cycles and unusually high fuel and logistics allocations for surface vessels. Colombian authorities deny these claims, calling them exaggerated and politically motivated, but they have not fully explained the sudden uptick in maritime exercises conducted over the past 2 months. What has intensified concerns is the collapse of several informal confidence-building mechanisms that once helped keep tensions manageable. Joint maritime coordination talks, quietly suspended earlier this year, have yet to resume. A long-standing hotline between naval commands reportedly experienced multiple technical disruptions during a recent week of heightened activity, forcing messages to be relayed through diplomatic intermediaries instead. Even routine notifications of naval movements, normally shared to avoid misunderstandings, have become sporadic and incomplete. Adding to the unease is the domestic political context in both countries. In Colombia, a fragile coalition government faces mounting pressure from nationalist factions that portray firmness toward Washington as a test of political credibility. In the United States, an election cycle has sharpened rhetoric around security and influence in the Western Hemisphere, leaving little appetite for gestures that could be framed as weakness. As a result, actions that might once have been quietly adjusted are now amplified for domestic audiences, reducing flexibility at precisely the moment it is most needed. Several analysts point to a classified bilateral memorandum, signed years ago and never formally revoked, that governs U.S. naval access to certain logistical facilities. According to unnamed sources, Colombian officials have recently questioned the document's validity, citing changed circumstances and a lack of parliamentary oversight at the time of signing. While no official withdrawal has been announced, the mere suggestion that such arrangements could be reconsidered has sent ripples through diplomatic and military circles. Against this backdrop, the geopolitical atmosphere has grown heavy with anticipation. Neither side appears to be actively seeking confrontation, yet both are preparing for scenarios in which restraint may fail. Statements grow shorter, movements more deliberate, and assumptions more pessimistic. It is within this environment, defined by unresolved grievances, political pressure, and eroding trust, that the maritime dimension of the conflict begins to take shape, transforming abstract tension into a tangible and potentially explosive reality at sea. As diplomatic friction deepened, the confrontation began to drift away from conference rooms and press briefings and into the maritime domain, where signals are less forgiving and consequences unfold faster. The sea offered both sides what land could not: strategic ambiguity. Warships can move without crossing borders, aircraft can patrol without landing, and intentions can be disguised as routine operations. In recent weeks, this ambiguity has become the defining feature of the standoff between Colombia and the United States. The first visible shift occurred quietly. Maritime traffic data showed an increase in naval transits through contested corridors of the Caribbean, officially logged as training or resupply movements. Colombian naval units began extending patrol durations beyond their usual cycles, remaining at sea for days longer than scheduled. U.S. vessels, already present in the region under long-standing security cooperation frameworks, adjusted their operating patterns, favoring forward positioning and wider patrol arcs. None of these moves violated international law, yet together they signaled a subtle but undeniable change. The conflict was no longer theoretical. Strategically, the maritime space carries outsized importance for both sides. For Colombia, coastal waters are tied to energy infrastructure, undersea communication cables, and major commercial ports that sustain the national economy. Any perception of vulnerability at sea quickly becomes a national security concern. For the United States, the same waters represent freedom of navigation routes, intelligence gathering zones, and access points critical to broader hemispheric operations. When these interests overlap, friction becomes almost inevitable. According to defense officials speaking off the record, both navies began operating under revised rules of awareness rather than rules of engagement. Crews were instructed to observe, shadow, and record, but to avoid direct interaction unless absolutely necessary. In practice, this led to prolonged close proximity maneuvers. Ships followed one another at distances measured in hundreds of meters rather than miles. Aircraft flew parallel courses, matching speed and altitude. Radar systems remained active longer than usual, and electronic surveillance intensified, creating an atmosphere of constant mutual scrutiny. Several incidents, never formally acknowledged, reportedly accelerated this transition. One involved a Colombian offshore patrol vessel detecting what it classified as persistent sonar activity near a designated economic zone. While U.S. officials dismissed the report as routine oceanographic surveying, Colombian commanders treated it as a potential intelligence-gathering operation. In another case, a U.S. maritime patrol aircraft altered course to inspect an unexpected formation of Colombian vessels conducting night maneuvers without prior notification. The encounter ended without incident, but analysts later noted that both sides deviated from standard safety buffers. The psychological dimension of naval operations also began to assert itself. Sailors trained for combat, but conditioned for restraint, found themselves operating in a gray zone, where every action carried interpretive weight. A sudden course correction could be read as evasive or provocative. A helicopter launch might be seen as reconnaissance or preparation. Even radio silence, often a routine practice, took on new meaning amid rising suspicion. Commanders were forced to make judgment calls in real time, aware that misinterpretation could escalate far beyond their control. Compounding the tension was the gradual militarization of language used to describe maritime activity. Official Colombian statements began emphasizing defensive depth and deterrent visibility, while U.S. briefings referenced operational readiness and persistent presence. Though still carefully calibrated, the shift suggested that both sides were preparing domestic audiences for the possibility that the sea would become the primary arena of confrontation. By the time international observers took notice, the maritime theater had effectively become the front line. What had started as political disagreement was now embodied in steel hulls, radar pulses, and plotted courses on digital charts. The water between the ships remained calm, but the strategic currents beneath were moving fast, pulling both sides deeper into a confrontation where distance was shrinking, options were narrowing, and the margin for error was rapidly disappearing. By the time naval activity intensified beyond routine posturing, both sides had already committed significant assets to the theater, transforming the maritime environment into a dense web of overlapping capabilities and intentions. As discussed earlier, the groundwork had been laid through weeks of political signaling and cautious maneuvering. What followed was a decisive concentration of force that left little doubt that the sea was now the central arena of risk. Carrier aviation, surface combatants, and undersea platforms converged in a relatively confined operating space, not as an explicit prelude to war, but as a calculated demonstration that neither side intended to yield strategic depth. The arrival of a U.S. carrier strike group altered the balance immediately. Though officially described as a rotational deployment, its composition suggested readiness rather than presence alone. Alongside the carrier came guided missile destroyers equipped for air defense and anti-submarine warfare, as well as logistics vessels capable of sustaining high-tempo operations for extended periods. Colombian naval planners, aware that matching such force symmetrically was neither feasible nor necessary, focused instead on denial and disruption strategies. Fast attack craft, coastal missile batteries, and diesel-electric submarines were repositioned to maximize uncertainty rather than firepower. The emphasis was not on defeating an adversary outright, but on complicating every assumption made by the opposing command. As fleets settled into their operating patterns, the risk of direct confrontation increased not because of deliberate aggression, but because of density and tempo. The maritime picture became crowded with contacts whose intent was difficult to classify in real time. Intelligence feeds grew noisy, saturated with signals, decoys, and ambiguous movements. Command centers on both sides worked around the clock, filtering data and issuing guidance that often lagged behind events unfolding at sea. The faster the pace of operations, the narrower the window for corrective diplomacy. The scenario most feared by planners was not a planned strike, but an uncontrolled encounter. A nighttime maneuver in contested waters. A sonar contact misidentified as hostile. A warning transmission interpreted as a threat. In one widely discussed internal assessment, analysts modeled a sequence in which a routine tracking operation escalated through incremental responses, each justified in isolation but catastrophic in combination. No single decision triggered open conflict. Instead, escalation emerged from momentum, reinforced by the assumption that backing down would invite further pressure. When the first exchange occurred, it did not resemble the opening of a traditional battle. There was no announcement, no clear line crossed. Electronic interference disrupted navigation systems in a limited area, forcing several vessels to switch to manual plotting. Unmanned aerial systems were launched and intercepted, their loss officially attributed to technical malfunction on both sides. These incidents, though bloodless, marked a turning point. They demonstrated that the threshold between observation and engagement had already been breached, even if no one was yet willing to name it as such. From there, the possibility of a broader naval clash became impossible to ignore. Tactical doctrines emphasized control of space rather than destruction of forces, but such distinctions tend to blur once assets are committed. Surface vessels maneuvered to protect high-value units. Aircraft flew combat air patrols with live ordnance, and submarines operated under restrictive conditions that increased stress and reduced margin for error. Each side sought to signal restraint while simultaneously preparing for rapid escalation, a paradox that defined the unfolding situation. The implications extended far beyond the immediate players. Regional navies adjusted their own postures, some increasing patrols to avoid being caught off guard, others withdrawing assets to avoid entanglement. Commercial shipping altered routes again, not because of declared hostilities, but because insurers and operators judged the risk environment unacceptable. Energy markets reacted to uncertainty rather than events, pricing in disruption before any material damage occurred. Diplomatic missions across the hemisphere began contingency planning, anticipating scenarios that only weeks earlier would have seemed implausible. What made the situation particularly volatile was the compression of time. Modern naval warfare operates at a speed that leaves little room for reflection once systems are activated. Decisions cascade through command structures in minutes, sometimes seconds, driven by pre-delegated authorities and automated responses. In such an environment, political leaders often find themselves reacting to events rather than shaping them, constrained by facts created at sea. The danger lay not in intent, but in inertia. As international concern mounted, calls for de-escalation grew louder, yet practical mechanisms to enforce it remained limited. Ceasefire frameworks presuppose open conflict. Crisis hotlines depend on trust that had already eroded. Meanwhile, forces remained in proximity, locked into patterns that were costly to sustain and politically difficult to reverse. Any withdrawal risked being read as concession, any advance as provocation. The confrontation thus entered its most dangerous phase not with explosions, but with exhaustion. Crews operating under constant alert, commanders weighing imperfect information, governments balancing external pressure against internal expectations. The sea, once a buffer between states, had become a narrow corridor where global stability hinged on judgment under stress. Whether the situation would break toward confrontation or pull back from the edge depended less on grand strategy than on the accumulation of small decisions, each one taken in isolation, yet together, capable of reshaping the geopolitical landscape in ways no one could fully control. As the situation reached its most precarious stage, the defining characteristic was no longer the concentration of forces or the intensity of operations already described, but the uncertainty surrounding what might come next. What had begun as signaling and posturing had evolved into a test of endurance, judgment, and political nerve. The danger now lay not in a single dramatic action, but in the cumulative weight of unresolved tension between Colombia and the United States, where every additional day of heightened readiness increased the probability of irreversible escalation. Military planners on both sides understood that once a certain threshold was crossed, control over events would diminish rapidly. War games conducted years earlier had consistently shown that naval confrontations between unequal but technologically capable forces tend to escalate asymmetrically. A limited incident could provoke a disproportionate response, not out of intent, but out of fear of losing initiative. This awareness led to increasingly rigid operational constraints, paradoxically making accidents more likely by reducing flexibility at the tactical level. Politically, the room for maneuver was shrinking. Leaders faced pressure from domestic audiences primed by weeks of alarmist media coverage and nationalist rhetoric. Calls for restraint were often framed as weakness, while ambiguous actions were interpreted through the harshest possible lens. In private, officials acknowledged that de-escalation would require a gesture significant enough to be credible, yet subtle enough to avoid humiliation. No such option presented itself easily. Every proposed step back carried the risk of being exploited by the other side, or condemned at home. The strategic uncertainty was compounded by the involvement of external actors. Allies and partners, while publicly urging calm, quietly prepared for spillover effects. Intelligence sharing intensified, emergency summits were discussed, and contingency plans were updated for scenarios ranging from limited naval clashes to broader regional instability. Even states with no direct stake in the confrontation adjusted their risk assessments, wary that a breakdown at sea could trigger economic and security shocks far beyond the immediate theater. From a military standpoint, the most troubling factor was decision latency. Advanced systems were designed to react faster than human cognition, and although safeguards existed, the temptation to rely on automated threat responses grew as fatigue set in. Analysts later noted that several near-miss incidents were resolved only because individual operators chose to delay action by seconds, allowing additional data to clarify ambiguous contacts. Such moments underscored how thin the margin had become between restraint and disaster. The longer the standoff persisted, the more it resembled a slow-burning crisis rather than a countdown to open war. Resources were drained, attention diverted, and strategic focus narrowed. Both sides began to face an uncomfortable question: how to end a confrontation that neither had formally begun. Without a clear starting point, there was no obvious endpoint, only a gradual accumulation of risk that could no longer be easily unwound. Ultimately, the outcome hinged less on power than on perception. Whether the crisis would diffuse or explode depended on how actions were interpreted, not how they were intended. Trust, already fragile, was the most scarce resource of all. As the world watched anxiously, it became clear that global stability was balanced not on treaties or firepower, but on the ability of a few individuals to resist momentum, accept uncertainty, and choose